In this video, I would like to share the aspects of literary negative role modeling in the David and Bathsheba narrative. This is found in 2 Samuel 12 to 14. What I'd like to do is work from the Hebrew text as well as the narrative to see what it teaches concerning moral and ethical lessons from the text. And there's a number of points. I'll try to list them in chronological order in my understanding of what the writer is trying to say. So let me just begin giving a summary of this section. Number one, the writer begins his narrative with an emphasis on David being in the wrong place. As a result, his fall occurs. Along with this, the narrator wants to show how idleness leads to David's downfall. Because David, the Hebrew reads, Yoshev, was dwelling in Jerusalem on Mishkavo, on his bed, the writer, I believe, is suggesting that David was open at this point to the trouble that would follow. Number two, the writer develops the complexity of evil. David began with adultery, followed it with deception, and ended with the murder of Uriah by the hands of the Ammonites. The fact that an evil action is never simple in its consequences, but often leads to great complexity in the results, and especially in those that it affects, is certainly a point that the writer of 2 Samuel is seeking to make. There seems to be, number three, the teaching that doing righteous deeds does not necessarily make one immune from the evil of another's action. The author illustrates this in Uriah and possibly Bathsheba. If the fact that Bathsheba was purifying herself is more than the author's way of saying that the child belonged to David, the intention may be to teach that piety and religious duty do not necessarily prevent one from being the victim of another's evil action. Uriah's insistence on his abstinence and on the vow not to go into his wife results in his tragic fate. Thus, when one acts according to what one perceives as right, one does not prevent oneself from becoming the victim of another's evil action, and may even help this to happen. And yet, it is Uriah's insistence on abstinence that forces David's crime to be exposed. I believe the author is saying that although being true to one's convictions may not always lead to a good result for the individual, in the end, it does expose evil. Number four, when one does evil, the first result is the effort to hide and try to hide the evil. This theme occurs in the temptation account in Genesis 3 and clearly appears in the Davidic narrative as David tries to get Uriah to go down to his house in order to prevent the discovery of his adulterous involvement with Bathsheba. Next, the writer teaches that while human authorities may abuse their power and even succeed in doing much harm, eventually Yahweh will judge. This idea of divine moral judgment comes out of what we might call the Litvort motif, with the repeated Vayishlach, and he sent. Litvort, Buber talked about it, where a word may throw light on a philosophical and theological and moral meaning in a text. And I think that is what is happening in my understanding of Vayishlach. Number 6. Next, loyalty is a theme which is developed by the character sketches of Uriah and Joab. The narrator warns the reader against the loyalty of a Uriah, a loyalty that may lead to tragic disappointment. On the other hand, the reader sees the unscrupulous loyalty of a Joab, who will use his loyalty for personal political goals. Both forms of false loyalty are exposed. The theme of loyalty to political rulers and its sometimes negative result may also be taught in the subtle statement in the text, "Your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead." By adding the word Avdacha, your servant, after Uriah's death by David's action, the writer emphasizes the irony, I believe, of naive loyalty. Number 7. The narrator shows that those who commit evil encourage those who support them in their evil. The writer emphasizes this in David's word to Joab, not to view Uriah's death as evil in his eyes. 2 Samuel 11:25. The narrator also teaches that Yahweh sees, though, such human evil, that it is not pleasing, though, in his eyes, and that he will bring forth his judgment against it. Although man in his evil calls good evil and evil good, Yahweh puts evil in its proper perspective. The author says this, I believe, in a repeated phrase, and this is found in the chapter 12. Al yera be'enecha et hadavar hazeh. This is not evil. Let this not be evil, this thing in your eyes. But then we see Yahweh's response. Vayera hadavar asher asa David be'enei Adonai. That is, but the thing which David did displease, what brought displeasure in the eyes of the Lord. So what man might bypass, the Lord does not. Number 8, there is clearly an anti-heroic, anti-monarchic ideology in the David story. One cannot trust a powerful king or a high official, for he might cause harm to you merely to satisfy his own desires. The writer shows this when David sends the letter to Joab through Uriah, making him the bearer of his own death warrant. Number 9. We see the tragedy of selfish evil also in the parable of Nathan, in which a rich man invades the life of a poor family. The writer wants the reader to feel that evil done to another has devastating effects. It strikes at the hearts of innocent people, bringing pain and sorrow in its path. He also wants to teach that one of the greatest evils in society occurs when the rich use their power to treat the poor and powerless unjustly, illustrated in the parable of David's actions. Next, the writer then also emphasizes David's crime as that of ingratitude and discontentment with what Yahweh had given him. David was already rich in wives from Saul's household, and Yahweh would have added more. But David was not content with all this. Instead, he wanted what was forbidden to him. And this idea emerges from 2 Samuel 12, verses 2 to 4 and 7 to 9. The repetition of the verb chamal in the parable of Nathan drives home a similar point, chamal, to spare. The rich man represented David did not spare Yachmo. He did not spare from chamal, lo chamal. He did not spare. And this is interesting, a contrast here, to take from the poor man's flock. He did not spare in the parable, the rich man, to take from the poor man's flock. Lo chamal, he did not spare. The verb chamal then can be rendered, as we've been saying, as spare or pity, showing that David really pitied his own possessions, but did not pity the poor Uriah's. He who had all did not pity the one who had only one. The author again emphasizes the reality of human experience, which he vividly shows in David's life, and that the rich and powerful often pity or spare their own possessions, but will not spare the meager possession of the powerless, if for selfish reasons they desire to possess it. Next, the narrator illustrates the truth that there must be a prophetic voice in society to address the oppression of the powerless by the powerful. Otherwise, society has no corrective at all for wrong. The stinging words of Nathan, Atah ha-ish, you are the man, must never be silenced when they are needed, or evil will have free reign. The fact that Nathan could so address Israel's king allows for the preservation of justice in society. If such a voice is silenced, society will experience the domination of evil. The writer shows how the true prophetic voice provides a platform for freeing society then from evil oppression. He teaches this in the way that the story unfolds or is told. Next, the crime of David by using Israel's enemies, the Ammonites, to do his evil is aggravated. The author teaches how someone may use others without their knowing it to hide one's own evil. This makes evil all the more insidious. And I believe, again, that this is shown throughout the text here by the author as he wants to drive home further emphasis of justice and the lack of it in David's attitude. Next, evil always has its consequences. This is taught in the statement that the sword shall never depart from your house forever in 2 Samuel 12:10. Evil committed thus has continuing consequences. In David's case, it would be the repetition of violence later seen within his own family with Absalom and Amnon. Next, evil is not just then a private affair. It will usually be made public, the text teaches. This is seen by David's own experience. What David had done in secret, Yahweh would let happen before all Israel and before the sun, when Absalom publicly lay with David's concubines. We see this again in comparing 2 Samuel 12:11-12 with chapter 16:21 and following. Next, David does make the proper response to his crime in the statement that he makes in 2 Samuel 12, verse 13. Notice David says, Chatati le'Adonai. In other words, I have sinned against the Lord with this sin. So the author shows in this confession of a broken covenant with Yahweh, what Yahweh basically, how he can restore, or how a person can be restored. This statement also is used by the narrator to show that to abuse others is to go against the Lord, against Yahweh, and that to relate to others in cruelty actually then seriously affects one's relationship with Yahweh. Next, number 16, as I'm sort of going through this in a chronological way, related to David's confession is another truth illustrated by the text. This is found in David's condemnation of Natan's parable in 2 Samuel 12, verse 5. And notice in that, David says that the man that abused the other is a ben mavet, that is, a man worthy of death. David does not quote any specific law, yet within himself he knows that the rich man was wrong in doing what he did in the parable that Nathan told. Thus, the narrator must be saying that within the human soul, there does exist the moral laws governing human relationships, and that even one such as David, who has disobeyed these laws, recognizes their existence. It surely is also then the writer's intention to show that what people condemn in others may not sometimes be recognized in themselves. Next, evil done by another often leads to the suffering of the innocent. This, I believe, is seen in both Uriah and David's own son, who dies. The writer is showing the reader another reality of life. The innocent suffer because of the evil that others may do. Then, as we look, numbering these in order in my observation, as we look at 18, while confession and repentance did bring about personal restoration of David with Yahweh. And we find this in the Psalms, for example. It could not, it's basically like Psalm 51, it could not prevent his own son from dying. Here the narrator addresses an area of wisdom, showing that forgiveness does not completely undo the damage that evil brings. It teaches that there are certain effects that are permanent. And I think that is true. Often there's the scars that evil leads or leaves. Next, by comparing the phrase, Vayishlach Adonai et Natan el David, and the Lord sent, Vayishlach et Natan el David, in 2 Samuel 12:1, with its repetition in 12:25, one sees the dual role of the prophet as one sent with a message of judgment, followed by a comparison of forgiveness after repentance is seen. As the sending of the prophet of Yahweh involves both ideas, the narrator, through this continuing leet vort repetition, shows this dual work of Yahweh of judgment followed by restoration after repentance. This second repetition of the verb shalach shows the possibility of a new beginning, even after evil has been repented of. Yahweh, after pronouncing judgment and securing repentance, brings about his overarching purpose in the future of the kingship that would eventually come of Solomon. This does not, though, condone David's evil. It is in spite of it. However, Yahweh brings his choice of Solomon to the throne. This is the narrator's way of dealing with the theodicy of Yahweh and human evil in society. As in the Joseph story, while his brothers cruelly sent Joseph into Egypt, Yahweh really sent Joseph to work out his purpose of the deliverance for his people. So here, while David's evil stands forever condemned with all of its tragic and injurious results, Yahweh sees the situation or uses the situation to his purpose. In the second Vayishlach phrase in this chapter, in 12:20 or to the end of the chapter, notice the phrase then occurs with the naming of Solomon as Yedidah, and that is beloved of Yahweh, is the author's way of showing this. In other words, the stress that I think the writer of this narrative is making is that God sends judgment and then sends mercy when there is repentance. Then the next observation. The law of retribution is further illustrated in the sequel narrative of Amnon, Tamar, and Absalom by showing how David's own evils were repeated in David's household. I believe this is the narrator's way of showing evil's effects, and also that the negative role modeling of a parent repeats itself often in children. The narrator then teaches another moral and ethical lesson, that pure lust does not lead to love, but to hate. What appears as love at first, and this now is in the Amnon, Absalom, Tamar section in the sequel. If it is lust, can only result in the opposite of love. The writer teaches this in the story of Amnon and Tamar, especially by using the verb levav, coupled with the idea of having cakes of levavot. In other words, love cakes. And what is interesting, I believe this is ironically illustrating this point. The making of levavot does not lead to heart love when lust is operating, as in Amnon's case. We saw also that wisdom in this section, I should say, that wisdom in this section to accomplish a goal leads only to tragedy if it is accompanied by moral bankruptcy in this narrative. The author illustrates this through the character of Yonadab. Yonadab applies his wisdom to accomplish a plan that leads to devastating results in society because he uses it to support the immoral goal of Amnon. Next, the author shows that evil increases when people fail to take responsibility for their evil. This is seen by Tamar's words to Amnon that putting her out to remain forever desolate is worse than the evil he had done to her in 2 Samuel 13:16. Next, the theme of innocent suffering is further illustrated in Tamar, who, in doing what she believed to be a good deed, in bringing the cakes of levavot, became an innocent victim of Amnon. Furthermore, the narrator also, I believe, pictures for the reader a negative father image. When David becomes angry with Amnon, but he does not discipline him. This same bad modeling will be seen in David's relationship to his son Absalom. As he fails, the text seems to imply to express forgiveness by refusing to see his son's face. The writer also shows Absalom allowing hatred to grow within him until it leads to violence against his brother Amnon. The author illustrates how obsessive hatred in a person leads to an action motivated by hatred. So what we're seeing here is, I think, ethics taught by narrative. In devastating irony, the writer is developing these themes, I believe, in the Absalom narrative. Next, the text powerfully contrasts Yahweh's forgiveness, though, with David's lack of it, and Yahweh's fatherhood with David's fatherhood. In the Amnon, Tamar, Absalom narrative, David does not forgive his son until after 5 years. Even then, his former forgiveness seems to be suspect. The Lord, on the other hand, quickly forgives David and blesses him with Solomon, Yedidya. This, I believe, is also taught when the narrator brings in the woman of Tekoa, when really she talks to David about how God devises means to bring back a banished one, so that he who is banished will not be an outcast. And she's applying this to David's own experience. The Lord thinks chashav machshavot. The Lord machashavot. That is, the Lord thinks thoughts to nida, the one who is banished. But David is not doing that. David, on the other hand, does not do that. The narrator suggests that failing to provide, I believe, the necessary forgiveness to a child can lead to irretrievable results in the life of the child. This also is found, I believe, in the parable of the woman of Tekoa, when she says, "For we must die and are as water which is spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again," in 2 Samuel 14:14. I believe the writer anticipates the future of David and Absalom when Absalom then is killed by Joab and cannot be gathered up again. Perhaps had David been quick to restore and forgive his son, the rebellion of Absalom might have prevented his death and preserved his life. But once he died, however, it is too late for David to forgive his son. And thus, the words of the woman of Tekoa become almost a prophetic warning to David. He did not restore his son who was driven away, who was nidah. Yet Yahweh does restore, as illustrated in his forgiveness of David. It's also interesting, the writer teaches that forgiveness must be applied before death, after which it is too late. And it is interesting, David may gather, and we see this, and he gathered Bathsheba to him after his evil, and later experienced Yahweh's forgiveness after judgment. But David would not be able to gather, and he's using a verb here, together, ye'asefu, from Asaph. David would not be able to gather his son to him and grant him forgiveness after his death. As water spilled on the ground, it is too late to gather up his son's life again. So as I've looked at these different literary points, I want to conclude by saying the narrator, I believe, uses the negative aspects of David's life and that of his family to teach many areas of moral and ethical truth. The author desires to teach his readers that these areas, through literary means, must be understood so one can live properly and wisely in relation to others and to the Lord. While this narrative does not express its wisdom in a typical proverbial maxim like the Mashle or the Proverbs, it nonetheless becomes the vehicle for teaching a broad spectrum of ethical wisdom. Using the subtleties of language, I believe, this literary craftsman, the author of this narrative, teaches a wide range of moral wisdom, which he expects his readers to extract and relate to the everyday experience of living in society before the Lord.